There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend beside you in the dark. You don't recognize them as tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of your world. You think it's just another evening, another shared silence, another breath held in the space between what you feel and what you are allowed to say. It is only later, when you trace the fault lines back to their origin, that you see it, the precise, singular instant when everything changed. For me, that moment was not loud. It was a whisper, a question that fell into the profound quiet of my bedroom like a stone into a deep, still well, the ripples spreading out in slow, concentric circles that I knew, even then, would alter the shoreline of my entire existence. It had been the culmination of a long, agonizingly beautiful ritual, one that had become the central, unspoken rhythm of our lives. Julian was asleep, or at least pretending to be, a warm, solid weight beside me in my bed. This itself was a geography I had learned to navigate with the careful precision of a cartographer mapping a new and treacherous continent. I knew the exact distance to maintain, the precise temperature change in the air between my skin and his. I knew the sound of his breathing as it deepened into sleep, a soft, percussive rhythm that was both a lullaby and a torment. Tonight, the silence was different. It was not the comfortable, empty silence of two friends sharing a space. It was a loaded silence, heavy with the gravity of things that had been accumulating for months, for years. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my own breathing a shallow, controlled thing, a desperate attempt not to disturb the fragile ecosystem of the moment. Then, his voice, rough with sleep and something else I couldn't name, broke the stillness. "Leo?" I turned my head on the pillow, just enough to see his silhouette against the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. He was on his side, facing me. I couldn't make out his expression, only the dark shape of his head, the rise and fall of his shoulder. My heart began a frantic, panic drumming against my ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. Yeah, my own voice was a croak, a betrayal of the calm I was trying to project. He was quiet for another long moment, and in that space, my mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. He was going to say he was sorry for intruding. He was going to say this was weird and he should go back to the couch, or back to his own apartment. He was going to put a name to the strangeness that had grown between us, and in doing so, he was going to sever it forever. I was bracing myself for the impact, for the cold, hard finality of a boundary being reestablished. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and the words were so soft, so vulnerable, they seemed to dissolve in the air. I don't think I know how to be gentle, how to be soft, with someone. Not really. I didn't know what to say. My mind, usually a library of carefully cataloged responses and analyses, was utterly blank. He was the swimmer, the one who moved through life with a powerful, confident grace, all forward momentum and contained strength. He was not someone I associated with a lack of knowledge, especially not about himself. He was the sun, and I was the one who orbited him, content to live in his light, to photograph it, to study it, but never to touch it. And then he moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but in the hyper-aware state I was in, it felt like a seismic event. He brought his hand up, palm open and uncertain in the sliver of space between our bodies. The gesture hung there, a question in physical form. "Teach me," he whispered, and the sound was the undoing of me. It was not a demand. It was a plea. "Teach me how you like to be touched." Before I could process the words, before I could even form a thought, he closed the remaining distance. He took my hand. It wasn't a grab or a friendly squeeze or any of the 100 other casual ways we had touched over the years. His fingers, long and calloused from a life I only partially witnessed, laced through mine with a deliberate, searching slowness. His thumb came to rest on the back of my hand, stroking the skin over my knuckles with an impossible tenderness. It was a revelation. It was the striking of a match in the dark powder keg of my heart. The contact sent a shockwave through my entire system, a current of heat and terror, and a hope so bright it was painful. This was the moment. The ordinary Tuesday night had just revealed itself to be the epicenter of my life's earthquake. And as his thumb continued its quiet, devastating exploration of my hand, I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. I was holding the hand of the man I loved, in the dark, in my bed, and he had just asked me to show him the way to my heart, using a map I never knew I was allowed to draw. To understand the sheer, earth-shattering gravity of that moment, you would have to understand the architecture of our friendship, the foundation upon which it was built. You would have to go back 10 years, to a sterile, cinder-block dorm room that smelled of fresh paint and institutional despair. I was there first, a skinny, anxious 18-year-old in a band t-shirt, meticulously arranging my collection of photography books on a flimsy particle board shelf. I was creating order, a small pocket of control in the overwhelming chaos of a new life away from home. I was a creature of quiet spaces and careful observation, and the prospect of sharing a room the size of a walk-in closet with a complete stranger was a unique form of torture I had been dreading for months. I had built walls around myself my entire life, and now I was being forced to share the blueprint with someone I hadn't even met. The door burst open without a knock, and he filled the frame. That's the only way to describe it. Julian didn't just enter a room. He occupied it, displacing the air with a kinetic, vibrant energy that felt like a physical force. He was all broad shoulders and a wide, easy grin, his wet hair plastered to his forehead from a late summer rain shower. He was carrying a duffel bag in one hand and a battered stereo system in the other, and he dropped them both with a clatter that made me jump. "Hey, you must be Leo," he said, his voice booming in the small space. He wiped a hand on his jeans and extended it to me. "I'm Julian. Sorry about the noise. Apparently, I'm your roommate. Hope you don't mind loud music and the smell of chlorine." His handshake was firm, warm, and brief. It was the first time he ever touched me. I remember thinking that his hand seemed to swallow mine, that there was an incredible, uncontainable life force humming just beneath his skin. He was everything I was not: loud, confident, effortlessly social, radiating a kind of golden, sun-drenched energy that seemed utterly at odds with the gray, overcast day outside. He was a swimmer, he explained, already on the university team, which explained the chlorine and the shoulders that seemed to take up half the room. I was a photographer, I mumbled, which explained the camera that was perpetually slung around my neck like a medical device. He saw my books, and instead of ignoring them, he picked one up, a collection of Ansel Adams landscapes. He whistled, a low, appreciative sound. "Wow, this is incredible," he said, flipping through the pages. "You take pictures like this?" "No," I said, probably too quickly. I look at them." He looked up from the book and met my eyes, and his grin softened into something more genuine, less of a performance. "Well, that's a start." That was the beginning. Our friendship was forged in that tiny room, a study in contrasts. He was chaos, and I was order. His side of the room was a perpetual explosion of clothes, textbooks, and wet towels. My side was a neat, curated space, my camera lenses arranged in a row, my prints hung with geometric precision. He would come crashing in at 2 in the morning, smelling of pool water and beer, and instead of waking me, he would somehow navigate the minefield of his own mess in the dark and collapse onto his bed. I would be up at dawn, slipping out with my camera to catch the morning light, leaving him to his well-earned sleep. We were two different species who had somehow learned to coexist in the same small habitat. But it was more than coexistence. We became essential to one another. His extroversion acted as a shield for my introversion, pulling me into social situations I would have otherwise avoided, but never pushing me to be someone I wasn't. He'd introduce me as Leo, my brilliant, artistic roommate who sees the world in ways the rest of us don't. A description so generous it made me blush, but it also made me feel seen. In return, I became his anchor. I was the one he came to when the pressure of his classes and the grueling demands of his sport became too much. He didn't need advice. He just needed a quiet space to fall apart for a little while, to let the charming, confident mask slip. He would lie on the floor of our room, staring at the ceiling, and talk about the pressure, the competition, the weight of his parents' expectations. I would just sit and listen, developing the photos I'd taken that day in the makeshift darkroom I'd set up in our shared bathroom, the red safe light casting us both in a strange, intimate glow. It was in that red-lit darkness, surrounded by the sharp, chemical smell of developer and fixer that I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic moment. It was a slow, creeping realization, like a photograph gradually appearing on a blank sheet of paper in a tray of chemicals. It was watching the way his face relaxed in sleep, the tension of his waking hours finally smoothed away. It was the sound of his laughter, a genuine, unforced bark of a laugh that he only ever seemed to let out when it was just the two of us. It was the casual, unthinking way he would drape an arm over my shoulder or lean against me while we watched a movie, a physical closeness that meant everything to me and, I was sure, nothing to him. I was a photographer. My entire way of being in the world was about observation, about framing a moment and capturing it without disturbing it. And so I observed my love for Julian in the same way. I framed it. I documented it in the quiet archive of my own mind. And I was careful, so incredibly careful, not to let it spill out and ruin the composition of our friendship. I learned to live with the quiet ache in my chest when he would talk about a girl he was interested in, the way his eyes would light up in a way they never did for me. I photographed him with his girlfriends, a series of bright, pretty girls who never seemed to quite understand the depth of the person they were with. I was the best friend, the good, solid, reliable friend. It was a role I played with award-winning skill, even as it was slowly hollowing me out from the inside. We built a life together after college. We got an apartment, a two-bedroom that felt like a palace after 4 years in a dorm. He got a high-powered job as a software consultant that sent him flying all over the country, and I built a freelance photography business out of our spare room, my darkroom now a permanent, sacred space. Our lives were different, but the dynamic remained the same. He was the comet, blazing through the world, and I was his fixed point, the home he always returned to. He would come home from a week-long trip, exhausted and strung out on airport coffee and corporate jargon, and dump his suitcase in the hall. He'd find me in the darkroom, and he would just stand in the doorway, letting the quiet and the stillness of my world wash over him until the tension in his shoulders started to recede. The foundation of our friendship was a solid, unshakable thing. It was built on a decade of shared history, of inside jokes and late-night confessions, of mutual support and profound, platonic love. But underneath that foundation, on my side at least, was a secret chamber, a hidden room where I kept my real feelings locked away. It was a beautiful, painful room, filled with 10 years of unsent letters, unspoken declarations, and a love so deep and patient it had become a part of my own cellular structure. And Julian, the unknowing initiator, had absolutely no idea he was about to be given the key. He had no idea that the solid ground he was standing on was about to give way. The shift began, as so many profound changes do, with an ending. Julian had been dating Chloe for nearly 3 years. On the surface, she was perfect for him. She was a lawyer, sharp and ambitious, with a laugh that could fill a room and a social grace that matched his own. They were a power couple, the kind of people who looked good in holiday photos and hosted impressive dinner parties. I had tried to like her, for Julian's sake. I had photographed their life together, documenting their trips, their parties, their seemingly perfect union, all while feeling like a court historian recording the history of a reign I knew, on some deep, instinctual level, was doomed to fail. Chloe didn't understand the quiet parts of Julian. She saw the confident consultant, the former star athlete, the charming host. She didn't see the man who would come home and collapse on the couch, too tired to speak. She didn't understand his need for silence, for the kind of undemanding presence that I had spent a decade perfecting. She interpreted his need for retreat as a withdrawal from her, a personal rejection. Their arguments, which I was sometimes an unwilling witness to when Julian would call me mid-fight, were always about the same thing: his perceived distance, his emotional unavailability. He was trying, he would tell me, but he always felt like he was failing a test he didn't have the study guide for. He was trying to be the person she wanted him to be, and the effort was exhausting him. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating implosion. Julian had been in Chicago for 2 weeks on a major project. He was stressed, working 14-hour days, and he and Chloe had been fighting over the phone every night. He came back a day early, hoping to surprise her, to have a real conversation, to try and fix things. He walked into their shared apartment. He had moved in with her about a year prior, a development that had felt like a physical blow to me, and found her packing a box. Not his things. Her things. She hadn't even had the decency to tell him to his face. She'd decided, while he was gone, that it was over. She told him, in the cool, clinical language of a lawyer making her case, that she couldn't live with a ghost. She said he was emotionally hollow, that he gave all the best parts of himself to his job and his friends. The pause before friends was loaded, a barb aimed directly at the space I occupied in his life, a space she had always resented but never fully understood. He didn't call me right away. That's how I knew how bad it was. Julian was a processor, but he processed externally, with me as his sounding board. His silence was a sign of a deep, foundational shock. It was nearly midnight when my doorbell rang. Not a buzz from the intercom, but a frantic, insistent pressing on the actual door to my apartment. I opened it to find him standing there, drenched. It wasn't raining. He was just drenched. His face was pale, his eyes were wide and vacant, and he was shivering, though the autumn night was mild. He was still wearing his suit from the airport, but it was rumpled and looked alien on him. "Leo," he said, and his voice was a raw, broken thing. It was the only word he said. I didn't ask questions. I just stepped aside and let him in. He walked into the middle of my living room and just stood there, dripping onto my hardwood floor, his expensive leather briefcase hanging from his hand like a dead weight. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck and had washed up on a strange shore, uncertain if it was hostile or safe. I took the briefcase from his hand, my fingers brushing his. He was ice cold. I led him to the couch and he sank into it, his body folding in on itself. This was the catalyst. This was the moment the carefully constructed world he had built for himself, the world he thought he was supposed to want, had shattered. And in the wreckage, the only thing he knew how to do was come to me. He wasn't looking for answers or for a place to stay. He was looking for a harbor, a place to drop anchor in the middle of a hurricane that had torn his life apart. For years, I had been his quiet port in a storm, but this was different. This was not a passing squall. This was a Category 5. And as I wrapped a blanket around his trembling shoulders, I felt the dynamic between us shift, a deep, tectonic groan that signaled the beginning of a new, and far more dangerous, kind of intimacy. He was no longer just visiting my shore. He was shipwrecked on it. And I knew, with a terrifying mix of dread and hope, that I would never be able to send him back out to sea. The ritual began that night. After I had managed to get a cup of hot tea into his shaking hands, after he had finally spoken, the story of Chloe and the packed boxes tumbling out of him in a torrent of confused, wounded words, he just stopped. The energy drained out of him completely, leaving him hollowed out and utterly still. He leaned his head back against the couch cushions and closed his eyes. I sat in the armchair opposite him, watching the flicker of his eyelids, the subtle tension in his jaw. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to gather him up, to hold him, to absorb his pain into myself. But those were impulses from the secret room, the one that had to remain locked. So I just sat, a silent vigil in the lamplight of my living room. After an hour, his breathing had evened out. He was asleep. I knew I should wake him, tell him he could take my bed and I would take the couch, but I couldn't bring myself to disturb him. He looked so fragile, so utterly spent. It was the first time in a long time I had seen him without the armor of his confidence. So I just pulled the blanket up higher over his shoulders, turned off the lamp, and went to my own room, leaving the door ajar. I spent the night listening for any sound from the living room, my own sleep a light, fretful thing. This was the first iteration, Julian, asleep on my couch, a refugee from his own life. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, a perfectly folded blanket on the cushion and a scribbled note on the coffee table. "Thanks for everything. I owe you." But he didn't go back to his now empty apartment. He checked into a hotel. For 3 days, he lived out of a suitcase in a sterile, impersonal room, calling me every few hours, his voice a thin, reedy connection to the world he used to know. On the 4th day, he called and asked, his voice small, "Hey, is the couch? Is it booked tonight?" It was meant as a joke, a weak attempt to lighten the weight of what he was asking. He wasn't asking for a place to crash. He was asking for sanctuary. "The couch is always available," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Come home, Julian." The word home slipped out, an unforced error, a truth I hadn't meant to speak aloud. There was a pause on the line, a sudden intake of breath on his end. I braced myself for him to correct me, to laugh it off, but he didn't. "Okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm on my way." And so the ritual evolved. He moved out of the hotel and into my living room. His suitcase took up permanent residence by the door, a constant reminder of his transient state. He would leave for work in the morning from my apartment and come back to it at night. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I would make coffee for 2 in the morning. I'd come home from a shoot to find he had ordered dinner. We would sit on the couch, the same couch that was now his bed, and watch movies. The easy familiarity of our old friendship, a comforting blanket over the raw, exposed wound of his new reality. But the couch was a boundary. It was a clear, physical demarcation. He was a guest, a temporary resident in my space. The ritual entered its next phase about 2 weeks in. He had been having nightmares, thrashing on the narrow cushions, waking up with a strangled cry, his face slick with sweat. He would never talk about them, just wave off my concern with a shaky hand and a forced smile. One night, a particularly bad one, I heard him cry out, a sharp, terrified sound that pierced the quiet of the apartment. I rushed out to the living room to find him sitting bolt upright, his hands tangled in the blanket, his eyes wide with a terror that wasn't entirely gone. Hey, you're okay," I said, my voice soft. I knelt in front of him, my hand hovering over his knee, not daring to touch him. "You're here. You're safe." He looked at me, his eyes slowly focusing, the ghosts of his dream receding. "Leo," he breathed, his voice ragged. "I'm so tired of being alone." The words were a gut punch. He was surrounded by people all day, and he had me, but he was still profoundly alone, adrift in the wreckage of his life. "I know," I said. He looked from me to the closed door of my bedroom, and then back to me. A silent question passed between us. It was a huge risk for him to ask, and an even bigger one for me to answer. The couch was safe. The couch had plausible deniability. My bed did not. But looking at his haunted face, I saw that his need for comfort was greater than my fear of complication. "The couch is a terrible place to sleep," I said, keeping my voice neutral, offering him an out, a practical reason. "My bed's big enough. You can take the side by the wall." He nodded, a small, grateful movement. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders like a child, and followed me into my room. That night, a new, far more precarious ritual was established. He slept in my bed. We were like 2 separate countries sharing a border, a thin strip of no man's land down the middle of the mattress. We lay stiffly, back to back, each of us hyper-aware of the other's presence. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small distance. I could hear every breath he took. Sleep felt impossible, a distant shore I could not reach. But the nightmares stopped. Slowly, over weeks that bled into months, the border began to dissolve. The no man's land shrank. It started with an accidental touch in the night, a foot brushing against a leg, followed by a muttered, sleepy apology. Then, the apologies stopped. The touches became less accidental. One night, I woke to find his arm thrown across my waist, his face buried in my shoulder, his breathing deep and even against my neck. My entire body went rigid. I lay there for what felt like hours, every nerve ending on fire, my heart a frantic, silent drum. I was terrified to move, to breathe, lest I wake him and shatter the spell. But he didn't wake. He just held on, as if I were a life raft in the middle of a vast, dark ocean. This became the new normal. The ritual was now a nightly act of unspoken, ambiguous intimacy. He would come home, we would eat, we would talk, and then we would simply go to bed. Together. The pretense was gone. There was no more talk of the couch, no more justification. It was just what we did. It was a source of profound comfort and excruciating anxiety for me. I was living in the secret room of my own heart, a dream I never dared to have. But it was a dream built on his pain, his need. I had no idea what it meant to him. For him, was this just a temporary solution? Was I just a warm body in the dark, a human heating pad to ward off the chill of loneliness? My photography began to change. I stopped looking for landscapes. I found myself obsessed with interiors, with the play of light and shadow in empty rooms, the way a single object on a table could tell a whole story of absence and presence. My darkroom became my confessional. I would stand in the red glowing dark, watching images of our shared apartment appear on paper. The indent his head left on his pillow, his coffee mug next to mine on the counter, his shoes kicked off by the door, and I would analyze every moment of our strange cohabitation. Every brush of his hand, every shared glance, every sleepy murmur. I was developing a photograph of our relationship, trying to make sense of the image that was emerging, trying to understand if the light I was seeing was real or just a chemical illusion, a trick of the dark. I was a man living on a knife's edge, suspended between the hope that this was real and the terror that it was all just a beautiful, fragile mirage. And so we arrived at that night, the night of the question. We had been living this way for almost 6 months. Julian had found his own apartment, a nice place closer to his office, but he had barely moved anything into it. He still spent 5 or 6 nights a week with me. His new apartment was a practical reality. My bed was his emotional one. The tension between us had been building for weeks, the unspoken thing in the room growing so large it was becoming difficult to breathe around it. We were like 2 weather systems, a high-pressure zone of my desperate hope and a low-pressure zone of his wounded confusion, swirling around each other, creating a volatile atmosphere that was bound to produce a storm. We were lying in bed, the silence stretching on, thicker than usual. I could feel him awake beside me, his energy a restless, thrumming thing in the dark. I was rehearsing casual conversation starters in my head, anything to break the spell, but my throat was tight. And then he spoke his truth, the soft, vulnerable confession that he didn't know how to be gentle, that he didn't know how to be soft. It was the first time he had ever admitted to a weakness that wasn't related to work or ambition. It was an admission about the very core of him, his ability to connect, to be intimate. When he whispered, teach me how you like to be touched," the world tilted on its axis. It was an abdication of his role as the confident one, the initiator. He was handing me the reins, giving me all the power, but it didn't feel like power. It felt like a terrifying, sacred trust. My mind, the ever-present narrator and analyst, went completely silent. For the first time, I wasn't thinking. I was only feeling. And then his fingers laced through mine. It wasn't a question of friendship anymore. It wasn't about comfort or platonic support. The way his thumbs stroked the back of my hand was a deliberate, specific language. It was a question, an exploration, and an apology all at once. It said, I see you. I am here. Is this okay? Slowly, every muscle in my body screaming with a decade of pent-up longing and fear, I turned my hand over in his and laced my fingers back through his. It was my answer. Yes. He shifted, moving closer, the warmth of his body a solid, undeniable presence. The moonlight caught the side of his face, and for the first time that night, I could see his expression. His eyes were wide, and in them, I saw a reflection of my own fear, my own hope, my own desperate yearning. He wasn't the confident swimmer anymore. He was just Julian, as lost and as found as I was. He lifted my hand, the one he was holding, and brought it to his lips. He pressed a soft, tentative kiss to my knuckles. He kept his eyes on mine as he did it, a silent vow passing between us. My breath hitched. The air was thick, charged, every molecule vibrating with what was about to happen. He leaned in, his movements agonizingly slow, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to retreat back into the safety of our friendship. But I was done with safety. I was done with the quiet observation deck. I had spent my life behind the lens, and for once, I wanted to be in the picture. I met him halfway. His lips were softer than I had ever imagined. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was a question. It was a confession. It was hesitant and shy and unbelievably sweet. It was the taste of salt from tears I hadn't realized he'd shed, and the faint, familiar scent of my own shampoo from his hair. It was the culmination of 10 years of unspoken words, of shared silences, of being the closest 2 people could be without ever truly touching. It was the sound of the lock on the secret room of my heart finally, gently, clicking open. In the quiet of my bedroom, with his hand in mine, Julian was not just learning how I liked to be touched. He was teaching me how it felt to be truly seen. The morning after was a study in silence and absence. I woke up slowly, drawn from a deep and dreamless sleep by the pale light of dawn. For a moment, I was disoriented, my body still humming with the ghost of the night before, the memory of his lips on mine, the feeling of his hand in my hand. I felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet rightness that settled deep in my bones. I rolled over, a smile already forming on my lips, expecting to find him there, expecting to navigate the new, beautiful awkwardness of a morning after with the person you've loved for a decade. But the other side of the bed was empty. It was not just empty, it was cold. The sheets were smooth, the pillow undented. He had been gone for hours. A knot of ice formed in the pit of my stomach, instantly extinguishing the warm glow of the previous night. I sat up, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm. I scanned the room. His clothes from yesterday were gone. His phone wasn't on the nightstand. The only evidence that he had been there at all was the faint scent of him that lingered in the air, a cruel, ghostly reminder. I got out of bed, my movements stiff, my body suddenly feeling heavy and old. I walked into the living room. The couch was neat, the blanket folded. There was no note. I checked my phone, my thumb shaking as I unlocked the screen. There was one message, sent at 5:30 in the morning. 3 words that felt like a death sentence. Sorry. Early meeting. That was it. No. I had a great time. No. We need to talk. No acknowledgement whatsoever of the seismic shift that had occurred between us. Just a bland, corporate excuse that was so transparently false it was insulting. Julian didn't have early meetings on Saturdays. He was a consultant. He controlled his own schedule on weekends. It was a lie, a flimsy wall he had thrown up between us, and it hurt more than the truth, whatever that might be, ever could. The beautiful, fragile structure we had built in the dark had been exposed to the harsh light of day, and it had crumbled into dust. I spent the day in a fog of disbelief and mounting dread. I replayed every moment of the night before, analyzing it with the desperate, obsessive focus of a detective examining a crime scene. Had I misread everything? Had the kiss been a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled confusion on his part that he now profoundly regretted? Had I, in my eagerness, pushed him? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting blade in my gut. I had spent 10 years carefully protecting our friendship, and I had shattered it in a single night of selfish hope. The silence from him was absolute. I texted him once, around noon, a casual, terrifyingly brave, "Hey, you okay?" The message was delivered. It was read. It was not answered. The 2 blue check marks on the screen felt like a judgment, a confirmation of my worst fears. He was avoiding me. The harbor had become a shipwreck, and he, the survivor, had swum away, leaving me to drown in the wreckage. The next few days were a special kind of hell. The apartment, which had been our shared sanctuary, suddenly felt vast and empty. Every corner held a memory of him. The couch where he used to sleep, the coffee mug he favored, the spot on the floor where he'd lie and talk for hours. It was all haunted. I tried to work, to lose myself in the red glowing solitude of my darkroom, but even that was no refuge. The images I developed seemed to mock me. Empty spaces, shadows, the ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. The silence stretched from one day into a week. A full week where the person who had been a constant, daily presence in my life for a decade vanished completely. It wasn't just the loss of a potential lover. It was the acute, agonizing loss of my best friend. On the 8th day, I broke. I couldn't live in the ambiguity anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive, a corrosive acid dissolving my insides. I needed to know. Even if the answer was, it was a mistake, even if it was, I don't feel that way about you. I needed to hear it. The silence was a form of torture I could no longer endure. So I did something I had never done before. I put on my jacket, walked out of my apartment, and went to his. Standing outside the door of his new, barely lived-in apartment felt like a complete reversal of our roles. For months, he had been the one coming to my door, seeking refuge. Now, I was the one on the outside, about to knock on a door that might never open. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock. I felt sick with anxiety, my heart pounding in my throat. He opened the door on the second knock. The sight of him was a shock. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants I'd seen him in a week ago. His hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes that I had never seen before. His face, usually so open and expressive, was a shuttered, guarded mask. He looked surprised to see me, and then a wave of something else, guilt, fear, maybe even relief, washed over his features before he could hide it. "Leo," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in days. "Hi," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "Can I come in?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment so brief I might have imagined it, before stepping back to let me pass. The apartment was chaos. Takeout containers were stacked on every surface. Clothes were strewn over the furniture, and cardboard boxes remained unopened, silent monuments to a life he hadn't started. The air was stale and smelled of neglect. He had built a fortress of squalor around himself. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. This was it. The confrontation. I had to be the one to break it. "A week, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "An entire week of silence. After that night, you disappear. You send me a 3-word text message like I'm a business acquaintance you're blowing off. What am I supposed to think?" He flinched, but he didn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the floor somewhere over my left shoulder. "I've been busy," he muttered, the excuse so lame it was insulting. "Don't," I said, and my voice cracked with a sudden surge of anger and hurt. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not after 10 years. Not after that night. I deserve more than that. We deserve more than that. Whatever that was, whatever you're feeling, you don't get to just disappear. You don't get to ghost me." My words seemed to land, finally breaking through his defensive shell. He slumped, his shoulders rounding, the anger draining out of him to be replaced by a profound weariness. He finally met my eyes, and they were filled with a misery so deep it stole my breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Leo, I am so sorry. I'm so messed up. Talk to me, Julian." I pleaded, my anger softening into desperation. "Just talk to me. What happened? What are you thinking? Did I do something wrong?" That question seemed to break him. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion. "No," he said, his voice thick. "You did everything right. That's what's so terrifying." He finally moved, walking over to the window and staring out at the city lights. "When Chloe left," he began, his voice low, "she said I was hollow, that I didn't know how to connect, and I thought she was just being cruel. But maybe she was right. My whole life, I've been performing. The good son, the star athlete, the successful consultant. It's all been a role, and it worked, until it didn't." He turned back to face me, his expression raw and agonizingly open. "That night, with you, that was the first time in my life I wasn't performing. When I asked you to teach me, it was the most honest thing I've ever said. And what happened next? The kiss, it felt more real than anything I have ever experienced. More real than 3 years with Chloe. More real than my entire goddamn life." He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. "And it terrified me, because it meant that my whole life has been a lie. It meant that this feeling I have for you, this thing I've been pushing down and ignoring and refusing to name for years, it's the only real thing about me. And I took that real, beautiful thing, and I brought it into your life, your safe place, and I thought, I'm going to ruin it. I'm going to ruin you. The one person who has ever been good and true and constant. I'm going to break you, just like I break everything else." He finally stopped, his chest heaving, his confession hanging in the air between us. It was all there. His fear, his confusion, his self-loathing, and underneath it all, a love that was just as deep and just as terrifying as my own. He hadn't run away from me. He had run away from himself, from the truth of what he felt, because he was afraid he was unworthy of it. He was trying to protect me from himself. The anger and hurt inside me dissolved, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, heartbreaking tenderness. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had been told his whole life what he was supposed to be, and he had just discovered, in the most profound way possible, that he was something else entirely. And it scared him to death. I closed the distance between us, my footsteps silent on the dusty floor. I stood in front of him, and for the first time, I was the one who initiated. I reached out and took his hand, the same way he had taken mine a week ago. His fingers were cold. I held on, warming them with my own. "You idiot," I said, my voice soft, laced with an affection that surprised even me. "You absolute, beautiful idiot. You think you're going to ruin me? Julian, I have been in love with you for 10 years. You are not a hurricane that's going to destroy me. You're the shore I've been trying to reach this whole time." His eyes widened, and he stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. The truth of my own confession, spoken so plainly after a decade of silence, settled between us, a final, clarifying piece of the puzzle. We just stood there for a long moment, in the middle of his messy, chaotic apartment, holding hands, the silence no longer a weapon, but a space for healing to begin. The conversation that followed was the most important one of our lives. There were no more pretenses, no more hidden rooms, or unspoken truths. We sat on the floor, amidst the takeout boxes and unpacked life, and we talked. I told him about the day I realized I loved him, in the red glow of our dorm room darkroom. I told him about the ache of watching him with other people, about the careful, painful construction of my role as the best friend. He listened, his eyes never leaving my face, his expression a mixture of wonder and regret. He, in turn, told me about his own confusion. He talked about a deep, persistent loneliness that had followed him his whole life, even when he was surrounded by people. He confessed that his relationships had always felt like a performance, an attempt to fit into a life he thought he was supposed to want. He admitted that his time with me, the quiet nights, the easy silences, had always been the only times he felt truly himself, but he had never allowed himself to question why. The kiss, he said, wasn't a discovery of a new feeling, but a confirmation of a truth he had been too afraid to face. He wasn't falling for me. He had been there the whole time, just floating in denial. As we talked, I started to clean. It was an instinctive, therapeutic act. I gathered up the trash, stacking the pizza boxes and Chinese food containers into a neat pile. He watched me for a moment, and then he joined in. We worked in a comfortable, synchronized silence, a domestic ballet of two people reclaiming a space, both literally and metaphorically. We were cleaning up the mess his fear had made. It was not a grand romantic gesture. It was better. It was real. It was work. It was two people deciding to build something together, starting with the foundation. When the apartment was clean, or at least cleaner, we were left standing in the middle of the living room, the space feeling lighter, clearer. The sun had set, and the city lights twinkled outside the window. We were both exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but for the first time in over a week, the air between us was clean. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quiet. "Always," I replied. He took a deep breath. Can I stay with you tonight? Not because I'm a mess, and not because I'm lonely, but because I want to be with you." My heart, which had been through a decathlon of emotion in the last 24 hours, gave a final, contented leap. "I think that can be arranged," I said, a real, genuine smile finally breaking through. We went back to my apartment. It felt different this time. Walking through the door was not an act of seeking refuge, but a deliberate choice of coming home. When we got to my bedroom, there was no hesitation, no question of who would sleep where. We changed and got into bed, the movements easy and natural. He didn't stay on his side. He turned to face me, propping himself up on one elbow. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. His touch was no longer uncertain. It was confident, tender, and full of a quiet reverence. "So," he said, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. "Lesson 2. Where do we begin?" I laughed, a soft, happy sound that felt like a release. I took his hand, the one that had started it all, and brought it to my chest, placing it flat over my heart. I held it there, letting him feel the steady, happy rhythm of it. "Here," I whispered. "We begin here." And so we did. We began to build a new life, not on the ruins of the old one, but on a fresh, honest foundation we had laid together. The resolution wasn't a single event, but a slow, patient process of learning and unlearning. It was in the small moments. The first time he held my hand in public, his fingers lacing through mine with a quiet, defiant pride. The day he finally unpacked the last box in his apartment, only to pack it again with my help so he could move his things, officially, into mine. The door to my bedroom was now closed at night, not to shut the world out, but to keep our world in, a sacred space that belonged only to us. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and then there are the moments that follow, the ones that are quiet and intentional and full of a beauty so profound it makes you ache. Falling in love with Julian had been a solitary act of observation, a photograph I developed in the dark. But being loved by him, that was a collaboration. It was learning that true intimacy wasn't about a grand, cinematic kiss in the dark, but about the quiet conversation that came after. It was about cleaning up the messes, talking through the fears, and making a conscious choice, every single day, to show up for each other. It was about the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, a silence no longer filled with unspoken yearning, but with the peaceful, certain rhythm of two hearts, finally, beating as one.